welcome to this SASE GVC Conversations webinar. I'm Rory Horner, a senior lecturer at the University of Manchester and one of the organizers of Network Go in SASE. And together with Jennifer Berra, Cornelia Starretts, and Matthew Alford, we're the current conveners of the Global Value Chains Network within SASE. A couple of years ago, we started a webinar series to bring a little bit more opportunities for discussions and continue some of the conversations that happen at the annual SASE conference, but outside the conference earlier in the year. And last year we started to do a focus on special issues and books that have been published on global value chains. So for today's session, we're going to be focusing on a special issue published last year in the Cambridge Journal of Regions, Economy and Society, which Huiwen, Gong, Martin Hess, Chris Foster, Robert Hassink, and Harry Gerritsen edited. There's a number of authors from the special issue are here, and of the initial panelists, Jana Kleibert will be speaking along with Jacopo Capello and Gary Gereffi. There may also be some other authors that may come in the conversation stage. The webinar, the structure, we're going to have some opening comments from the editors of the special issue, then from Jana, Jacopo, and Gary. That will then be followed by plenty of opportunity for discussion, questions, and we're really looking forward because there's a really great group of people here who are all experts on global value chains and all, I'm sure, have a lot of your interesting own contributions on what the current reconfigurations are of GVCs and GPN's global production networks. And so we're really keen to get your thoughts and have a really good conversation. One final logistical thing, we are going to record just the initial presentation part, so where the panelists are speaking. After that, we will turn the recording off. So we're going to try and have contributions from the panelists first, and then really keen to get your comments, questions after that. Feel free to do so either by posting in the chat or by raising your hand. So without further ado, I'm going to pass over to Huiwen and Martin to open up with some of their thoughts, both on their introduction to the special issue, and we've asked all the panelists to both speak to their initial papers, but also how they kind of see this issue going forward and what has changed since their paper came out. So over to you, Huiwen and Martin, and thanks everybody for joining us.
Okay, thanks very much, Rory, and hello everybody. I want to start us off together with Huiwen and just reflect a little bit on our introductory paper to this special issue. And let me start just with a simple observation to remind ourselves why we are talking about deglobalization. Could you pull up the next slide, please? So here we go. We all know about these things, but just as a reminder, some context. According to this, obviously, we are now in the first period since the Second World War, where world trade or world trade openness as a ratio of world trade to GDP seems to be in decline. So this seems to resemble an economic reality that has created a lot of anxiety among policymakers across the world about future economic growth. So that's one of the contexts. But if we look a little more closely, I think it might still be questionable if this really indicating decline as we have seen in the interwar period. And looking at another marker of globalization and deglobalization, if you want to move to the next slide, Huiwen. I'll move on rapidly. Again, we know all that. But as opposed to world trade data, if you look at FDI flows, the picture seems a little less conclusive. And it provides more of a mixed picture where you could argue that still we see a kind of secular trend of an increase in FDI flows, which in part might be due to the fact that crises often also present opportunities for investment, as we have seen in the wake of the Asian financial crisis in the late 90s, and to some extent even in the financial crisis in the last decade. A second point I want to make before I pass on to Huiwen, next slide please, is that apart from an economic reality or perceived economic reality, deglobalization is very much still at the stage of discourse. And this discourse happens both on the political right and the political left in different arenas around the economic globalization, but also a question of social globalization, cultural, environmental issues. And the political right and the political left take different stances on that. So on the political left, we have obviously pro-environment groups that strongly argue for deglobalization in the name of environmental protection and reducing emissions. At the same time, they often tend to have a strong anti-neoliberal economic globalization stance as well, and often are split on questions around migration as another marker of globalization. Whereas on the political right, despite attempts to reshore and nearshore, they are still by and large pro-global trade and devise policies and continue to devise policies to attract foreign direct investment. At the same time, they obviously are very much anti-globalization and movement of people and migration, and also, at least in the UK context, have started to instigate what we refer to here as culture wars. Next slide, please. So maybe it might be more sensible, rather than talk about deglobalization or globalization in reverse, to talk about multipolar globalization, as Johan Oldekopp and co-authors, including Rory, have indicated in this World Development paper, and which also has been highlighted in a recent report by the European Commission on Foreign Relations that was specifically focused on multipolar globalization instead of deglobalization. But now over to Huiwen to briefly talk us through what we regard as some of the drivers of deglobalization.
Great, thanks a lot, Martin. Yeah, I think based on the special issue papers and our also own observation or our own research in this field, and we sort of derive for driving forces for this deglobalization or this discourse. And of course, one of them is this geopolitical uncertainty and tensions, and we know many of those already, Brexit or trade wars especially between the US and China. And also we see like stalled WTO negotiations. And recently we're seeing like increased number of like national policies, industry-wise or let's say economic-wise, that are very much national protectionism. For example, the Inflation Reduction Act or the European Chips Act and so on and so forth. So these are like very powerful sort of drivers that are leading to some extent of this trend towards deglobalization or regionalization. And the second driver is, of course, very important, climate change. And this discourse is also everywhere in newspaper, but also in scientific publications and discussions. And one thing is also how do we green the global value chain, given that a lot of those manufacturing activities, they need to be decarbonized, or let's say go low CO2 emissions. So there's a lot of things technology-wise, but also maybe on the production side, a lot has to be happen in order to really green the value chain, and that also lead to the geography configurations being changed and adapted in this context. And of course, energy transition and security is always an issue, especially now we, for example, in the context of Europe, we know how important, for example, it is to shift rapidly to renewable energies in order to, let's say, reduce the dependence on fossil fuel sources, and also the dependence, for example, on Russia. And of course, sustainability transitions, for example, e-mobilities, in really just over the last couple of years, we see like huge amount of battery gigafactories being announced in the European context, because we need really a lot of batteries in order to facilitate the e-mobility transition. So these are like climate change provide also a lot of like challenges, but also opportunities for those kind of transition, so to say. And of course, technological revolution, we know like automation on robotics and also big data and so on and so forth. But also recently, the discussion on ChatGPT, I think it has really huge impact, especially on those high-end, or let's say like high-end services and industries that are dependent very much on like not so much, let's say, on production, but on thinking on those kind of, let's say, middle class jobs. And I think last year, like Google and Facebook and all those IT companies, they laid off in total more than 100,000 jobs worldwide. So those kind of technological revolution for sure have big impact on the job, on the geographic configuration of the GVC and GPN. And last but not least, we also have all kinds of crises and shocks. And as the COVID is still reminding us how vulnerable also we are, and also how vulnerable the whole GVC, GPNs are. They can easily be disrupted, and we need to ensure, for example, the supply of essential goods like food, energy, or medical devices. And these are all like important considerations or that have been repeatedly discussed in political discourses, but also in media and many other outlets on how and what can be done in order to make sure that those shortages can be sort of solved rapidly. And so overall, we think these four forces, and combined with the fundamental logic of capitalism, which is like endless expansion and this profit-driven, always, let's say, constantly looking for places and market to expand. And this forces and challenges combined, they lead to like the reconfiguration of the GVC and GPNs in a sense that we do not necessarily see like the death of globalization, but we do see different configurations, and where the economic course, let's say, might be shifting, or let's say the peripheral regions in the global economic map might be changing. So this is what we sort of argued in paper. Now over to Martin.
Thanks, Huiwen. Before concluding, just briefly, I want also to point out maybe some of the dangers of deglobalization, which often is framed as a somewhat panacea to all the issues Huiwen has just outlined, climate change among others. But deglobalization also comes with the potential for protectionism, and again, there's plenty of evidence for that in various arenas. It also might lead to a race to the bottom in many ways. That brings back what already is happening in value chains across the globe to the advanced economies. When nearshoring and reshoring takes place, it might lead to renewed and revitalized territorial politics around industrial zones, investment zones, etc., as we see in the UK, for instance, but also potentially a danger of ratcheting down the standards, labor standards, while at the same time trying to lure international and global investment. And that results then possibly in a much more national internal fragmentation of economic space that might affect labor and also potentially the national tax base in many countries. Next slide, please. And so states of discipline, which we have seen around the world, whether it's in garment supply chains and value chains or in any other industries, including electronics, might be something that we then see more often coming back to what so far, has been seen as rather, void of these issues around labor disciplining, and that might take a new and more pronounced form by expanding state authoritarianism in the wake of economic nationalism, and disciplining labor. The pendulum in that context might then, in advanced economies as much as elsewhere, swing much more from consensus that had been achieved to coercion. Again, I'm maybe a little bit biased here by the UK context, but there are clear signs about, reining in union law, for instance, and other things that start to affect the labor force in this country and others. And then just to conclude, final slide, please. I would like to argue, and I guess we would like to argue, deglobalization, first of all, is still very much at a stage of discourse, rather than something we can ascertain as a sustained reality. We'll have to wait and see for that, I guess. And it's a double-edged sword. It's Jana's faced in many ways as it reproduces economic winners and losers, and will play out in different arenas in different ways. The effects on climate change and biodiversity of reshoring, nearshoring, still, I think, are uncertain, and the assumption that it will benefit the environment still have to be proven in many ways. And the developmental outcomes in the advanced economies in the global north, as much as in the global south, are still poorly understood. And as Huiwen said, there's a capitalist logic to the world economy, and capital will continue to search for a spatial fix, changing the contours, the geographical contours of the archipelago economy, but not necessarily meaning a full-blown deglobalization, as some observers would have it. So thank you very much, and sorry for being a little bit over time.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Huiwen and Martin, for providing that great opening framing to the topic. And next is Jana Kleibert, Professor of Geography at the University of Hamburg.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you very much also for the kind invitation to speak today and present one of the papers of the special issue. And I guess it's a bit of an outlier. It's a bit of an odd paper in the special issue in that it is conceptual rather than drawing on new empirical data. And it's written together with my colleague, Michiel van Meteren from Utrecht University, is actually first author on the paper that we've written, and that is the result of fairly long discussions we've had over several years, trying to think through the spatialities of globalization, and then taking this opportunity and thinking through what would a deglobalization world actually look like, what geographic shape would it take. And in this paper, we trace the long-lasting archipelago structure that Martin just alluded to already. I guess it's the same argument that we're trying to make here that he ended with, is that we'll see that archipelago structure being reproduced in the global economy. Now, just very briefly, because it's so central, is what is the archipelago economy? The notion of the archipelago is a very often used metaphor in describing the structure of the world economy. And this, we can trace that also already back to Braudel, who argued that the capitalist world economy is a hierarchical archipelago of trading cities that draw in their wealth from the surrounding sea of subsistence relations. And so the idea that the world economy is characterized by interconnected islands that are the nodes and that act as nodes within a network of the sea, where the sea is the space between these nodes. And the world economy has been theorized as a succession of different international divisions of labor. And all of them have been described with a geographical metaphor of the archipelago. So we're taking here a longer term view, not starting from post-World War II, but even longer, and reviewing different spatial divisions of labor. And our key argument is that the restructured global economy in the light of processes that we can think of as globalization in reverse or deglobalization is likely to keep the shape of this archipelago structure. Very briefly, there's we can just differentiate between different international divisions of labor, the old international or original international division of labor, then in the 1980s, a new international division of labor, and then more recently calls for what should be called a new international division of labor has emerged. And the idea here is not that the idea of the world economy and these international divisions of labor is not that there's no outside anymore to these capitalist relations. Of course, they still exist, but these places are connected in relations of trade and a division of labor. And so this division of labor is a geographically articulated social structure, and this can change. And it's important to note that these three kind of phases of international divisions of labor are not sort of sequential in that one follows from the other, and then the phase is broken and a completely new system operates. But of course, they interact and they're overlaying with each other. And so I just want to give some illustrations of how these how these different divisions of labor have been thought of as archipelago economies, by also drawing on some images that we found in the literature that kind of highlight how, also graphically highlight how these have been thought of as archipelagos. So starting with the old international division of labor, here it's an era dominated by capitalist merchant class, and so here the colonial structures of setting up island-like infrastructure that fosters unequal development and resource exploitation. And so here the image that you can see is from Frank, who thought of this metropolis satellite structure where the core appropriates the surplus through intermediate nodes. Then, probably a very familiar diagram to many here, when we move to the new international division of labor that is dominated by multinational corporations and also global value chains, we see that simple routine manufacturing is taking place in the periphery, profiting from low wages and low levels of unionization, with more complex and lucrative tasks remaining in the core. This is often done through special economic zones. And here we can also see the archipelago structure visible in the GPN stylized map. A final one is the contemporary era of financialization. And here, as an example, you can see the world city structure that orchestrates the financialized world economy and is often described as a world city archipelago. And of course, offshore finance is often constituted quite literally by islands, island states. But what matters here is less their feature as being island states, but rather the different legal regimes that matter for enabling geographical wealth transfers and a network system of what has been described as archipelago capitalism. So in our paper, we then theorize the mechanisms of bordering, of connecting, of disassociation that constitute the islands and that makes the system operate. But I'll skip this for brevity because I think this is not so central to the discussion today. But rather what I want to talk about is what does this analysis show for the geographies of reverse globalization. So first, what we don't want to advocate is a new term and calling for a new phase of international division of labor, but rather be more careful about that and say that these are longer term trends, and it takes, I guess it's a very cautious way of saying it takes longer time also to be able to look at these. It's probably early to use the current disruptive moment for that. Also, this analysis shows that when we think about what would the geographies of deglobalization look like, that we'll probably not see a return to a containerized model of the economy based on nation states. So from our analysis, this seems to be a very unlikely feature. We also went through the challenges in our paper, the quadruple challenges that Huiwen and Martin discussed and presented in the beginning. So we assessed these, and just to give one example, and the result of our assessment basically is that the need to flexibly modulate this kind of bordering and connectivity in light of crisis and shocks rather strengthens than diminishes the role of the archipelago character of the world economy. So to give one example, the COVID-19 disruptions led, of course, to temporary mobility disruptions in many ways, but they also showed the importance of contingency plannings, of networks that allow switching, and thus offshoring and reshoring will probably exist in tandem, and it's less likely to see a full reversal in that. Another key point for us when assessing these changes was the idea that risk and vulnerability become key in the current era. And this means that possibly it's not only about the transfer of wealth that was key within the different international divisions of labor that we saw between the islands and among the islands that have structured the world economy, but rather it becomes important to focus on the islands that are able to shield themselves from risk, and then the islands that bear risks in this process. So I think this will be interesting moving forward when we try to make sense also more empirically of the shifts that will occur within the archipelago economy as a structure. To briefly bring in one example from my own contemporary research, ongoing research on higher education, and that maybe can exemplify the two previous points, is this example from a UK university, the Lancaster University, that just set up a subsidiary in Leipzig. And this is an example of a geopolitical shift, of course, Brexit, that then leads and increases risks and uncertainty for British higher education institutions that act like market actors in this environment and aim to ensure themselves against risk. And they do so by creating a UK island, if you like, within Germany with their institution in order to be able to be part of EU territory. And this has three elements, this strategy. For one, it enables the recruitment of EU students at own fee levels that they can set freely because they're not bound by UK regulation in this regard. So that might enable them to attract more EU students. This is probably not the most important criteria, though, the most important reason. More important seems to be, from my analysis and from the marketing materials that we can see, is that the recruitment of third country students that do face a harsher visa situation within the UK. So the Lancaster campus in Leipzig explicitly targets Indian students to move because of better visa opportunities, also for employment post-graduation in Germany, while still getting a British degree. That is, in some parts at least, taught by an Australian for-profit provider. So the story, again, is one of complex globalization rather than deglobalization. And a final argument here for institutions is also access to research funding. So what should future research do? I think it's probably useful or less useful to look at deglobalization and think of what will the global structure of the world economy look like, and to what extent will that change. We're probably not in the position to say that at the moment, but I think empirical research will be useful, and especially empirical research that looks more in depth at the restructuring of the geographies of globalization rather than deglobalization. And here there's 4 points I would like to make. One is that we should think of the distribution of risks, but also risk hedging and vulnerability in global value chains and global production networks. I do believe the geopolitical dimensions are of crucial importance. And I think to what extent they lead to further offshoring or reshoring and different strategies will be interesting. More empirical research on the restructuring of global value chains in different industries. And I think it would be useful to also look at services industries and not just manufacturing, because I think some of the services industries, financial services industries, might show a very different picture here as well. And then, and this is what we've tried to do in our paper, is keep in mind and try to look at the deeper contextualizations, also historically, but also geographically, of continuities and change in this phenomenon. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks, Jana, for that longer-term perspective, thinking through the idea of the archipelago to question whether there's really another new international division of labor emerging, and some really interesting ideas there for future research at the end. The third set of speakers is Gary Gereffi from Duke University and Jacopo Canello from University of Parma, who contributed another of the papers to the special issue. After their presentation, we're then going to open up to questions and discussions, so feel free to start thinking of any comments you might like to make. But over to you, Gary and Jacopo.
Great. Thanks, Rory, for the introduction, and I'm glad to see the next iteration of the GVC Conversations webinar. I think it's a good device. So the paper that we'll be talking about is co-authored with Giulio Buccioni, Jacopo Canello, and myself. Giulio is in India doing field work at the moment, so Jacopo and I will pick up the presentation. And I think this paper addresses a number of the themes that have already been mentioned by Martin and Huiwen and Jana. So we can just go to the next slide, Jacopo, and I'll focus my comments just on this slide. So I just want to introduce the paper by saying that I think there are 3 main sets of issues that motivated this paper. And the first of those ties very directly into this debate about deglobalization or reglobalization. Which direction is the global economy moving, and what's the impact of that on global value chains. And I think as Martin and Huiwen's presentation outlined really well, there are multiple drivers of this debate and this interest in deglobalization. And I think as Jana pointed out, there's quite different configurations. We wanted to focus particularly on the reshoring sets of issues, because part of the driver for the discussion of the fragmentation of global value chains, especially since the pandemic, was that the GVCs have become overextended, and they begin to reveal the vulnerabilities that especially advanced industrial countries created when they moved so much production offshore. And at least in the US, but I think also in Europe and elsewhere, the emphasis on reshoring is a way to try to rebuild the manufacturing sector of advanced industrial economies, and to kind of retreat into a pre-globalization world of nation states competing with one another. So I think the debate is very much alive, and the topic of reshoring, I think, really allows us to think about some very specific issues connected to what might be happening empirically. So that set of conversation was one big driver. A second driver for our paper was the case of Italy. So the empirical analysis in the paper focuses on a unique data set dealing with Italian micro and small enterprises. But in the bigger globalization and GVC debate, Italy has been very well known for having a fairly large number of successful industrial districts, especially in the northern part of the country. And these industrial districts were known because they were clusters focused on particular products and industries that had a very distinct ecosystem. And going back to Peoria and Sable, that discussion about the role of clusters in the global economy and their continued vitality has been a very important theme. And throughout Europe, there's a lot of these clusters, and other countries as well. So we wanted to focus on this question of how Italy's industrial clusters, and we focus particularly on clothing and footwear, how they're dealing with the problems of globalization. And in particular, are they going to be forced into moving production offshore, or can they retain some degree of local vitality? So that's a key theme in terms of how Italy and local clusters or these industrial districts deal with the challenges of globalization. And the third big issue that I think drives our particular analysis is this emphasis on small, medium enterprises, or in our paper, we focus specifically on micro and small enterprises, the very smallest firms in these value chains. And from a global value chain perspective, typically small, medium enterprises were considered to be on the margins of global value chains. There's been so much discussion in the governance literature on lead firms, and then later on first-tier suppliers and big countries. So it seems like SMEs get lost in that discussion, that, you know, at best, they're the sets of firms that are most likely to be marginalized or to disappear when times get rough. But what's interesting about this Italian data set that Jacopo will be telling you about is it's a data set that allows us to look at decisions by micro and small enterprises about reshoring or offshoring in the Italian clothing and footwear industry. And I think that addresses a bigger problem in the economics literature around small firms. There's almost this assumption that SMEs don't have strategies. The only companies that have strategies are the big ones, the multinationals and the mid-sized firms. But this data set allows us to look at decisions made by MSEs about reshoring or staying in Italy. And I think one of our key findings is that most of the MSEs, micro small enterprises in our sample, actually adopted dual sourcing strategies with respect to apparel. On the one hand, they made certain decisions that allowed them to move some of their production operations offshore. But on the other hand, simultaneously, they were able to preserve and increase the productivity of their local supply base in Italy. So here we see SMEs or MSCs involved in a kind of complex dual sourcing strategy where they're doing some offshore production, but also retaining domestic suppliers. But what's nice about this particular, I think, analysis is we have the data that allows us to speak much more directly to how these decisions played out. So let me turn the floor over to Jacopo because he can tell you a lot more about the data set itself and some of the key findings we came up with.
Thank you, Gary. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. All right, so Gary already gave an excellent overview of the idea behind our paper. So let me give you a little bit more details on the empirical approach, on the database we use for this empirical analysis. And I will also give you an overview of the main findings and on our interpretation of these findings. But of course, we are welcome to hear your comments regarding possible interpretation of these results we find using these very detailed database on micro and small enterprises. So what is the aim of this empirical analysis? The idea is to look at the impact of reshoring by using this perspective that is focused on micro and small enterprises, first of all, and then we are interested in the consequences of reshoring in terms of local subcontracting networks, right? So we have micro and small firms that are bringing production back home, in this case, back to Italy. And we are interested in looking at the impact of this reshoring decision by micro and small enterprises on the dynamics of local subcontracting networks in Italy. The territorial unit we use is local labor market area, and our main focus is on local subcontractors. So basically, firms that have subcontracting agreements with micro and small firms. They are themselves, of course, micro and small firms, local subcontractors. They operate generally within, a very specific territorial boundary, the region in which they are located. And what we are interested is in looking at the effects of reshoring on three main outcomes. So the birth rates of local subcontractors, their survival chances, and the growth or their productivity level. And as we will see, we find a positive and significant relationship between a reshoring decision by micro and small firms and productivity growth by local subcontractors. And on the other hand, we don't find any significant impact on local subcontractor birth rates and survival chances. And I will give you in a minute an explanation of that we found to interpret these results. So database, again, as Gary already mentioned, this is a unique database provided by the Italian Ministry of Economy and Finance. This is the annual survey on micro and small enterprises. So we have all firms whose turnover is lower than 7.5 million euros. So as you can imagine, we are talking about very small firms. And this is very relevant for the goals of these research for three main reasons, I would say. So first of all, of course, this allows us to focus on this specific part of the manufacturing industry that is especially relevant in Italy. As you know, as Gary already mentioned, micro and small firms are a very important part of manufacturing industry in Italy. And also they are a large share of the firm population inside industrial districts. Another benefits of this database is also the possibility to discriminate firms according to their position in the value chain. Okay, so we have the possibility to discriminate between final firms, so firms that are focused on the production of final goods that directly serve final market, and then we can discriminate this final firm from subcontracting firms. Okay, So firms specialize typically in producing parts and components for the final firms. So we have the possibility to discriminate these large groups of firms, these two groups of firms. And we have also the possibility to discriminate between national and local subcontractors. So we have the possibility to see which is the area in which subcontractors are operating. So as you can imagine, we have this very detailed database that can be exploited to answer our research question. Last but not least, possibility to track reshoring activity. So we know the exact year in which the firm has started offshoring production abroad. In this case, offshoring is defined as the decision to establish link with a foreign supplier. So we are talking about offshore outsourcing, essentially. So we have the possibility to study, to identify the year in which offshore outsourcing decisions are taken, and we also have the possibility to define when production is brought back home. So when these international subcontracting relationships are broken and the firm decides to move production back home. So for these three reasons, the database is especially suitable to answer not only this research question, but also several different questions. We have also published another paper with Gary and Giulio that essentially looks at other aspects related to global value chains decision about these specific type of firms. In any case, so the focus of this analysis is on Italian clothing and footwear production, two sectors that are especially relevant for the Italian economy, two sectors that have been affected by offshoring decision in the last 10 years, and also two industries where buyer-supplier relationships are especially important. So for all these reasons, we think that focusing on this specific sector will allow us to, find specific insights that will allow to understand the dynamics behind reshoring and also the regional consequences of reshoring, which is the main focus of our analysis. So very briefly, just few data on these reshoring dynamics. We are looking at the period immediately following the 2008-2009 financial crisis. And as you can see, right, the reshoring process was already there back in 2008-2015, right? So here we have the offshore outsourcing micro and small enterprises divided by those that persist in their offshore outsourcing strategies, those that start offshoring, and those that bring production back home, okay? So if you look at the orange bar, you see the number of backshoring small and medium enterprises operating in the clothing and footwear industry in the period under consideration. And the first message, which we think is quite interesting, is that reshoring decision or backshoring, I mean, we use this as a interchangeably, but the idea is that bringing production back home was already something, a strategy that was performed by micro and small firms in the period between immediately following the financial crisis. So this is something that is, we think, particularly relevant. 10% of offshore outsourcing firms repatriated production in each of the year considered in this analysis. What is more relevant for the goal of this analysis is the consequence of this reshoring decision on local subcontracting networks. So are there any implication associated with the decision of these micro and small firms to bring production back to Italy? And, we have a series of regression. I don't want to bore you with the technical details of this regression. I think it's better to focus on the key highlights, the main findings, and we have three main findings that result from this empirical analysis. The first one is that reshoring decision do not affect significantly local subcontractor birth rates, and the same goes for survival rates. So you don't see any negative or positive significant impact on local subcontractor survival chances associated with reshoring decision by micro and small firms. What is interesting is that we found a positive and significant effect associated with reshoring by small and micro and small firms in terms of productivity growth by local subcontractor. So essentially, higher levels of reshoring in a specific regions are positively correlated with local subcontractors' productivity growth in the same region. This is the main effect that we found in our data. Now, what is the interpretation of these findings? And we thought a lot together with Gary and Giulio about possible interpretation of these interesting and to some extent surprising findings. We were expecting to find a significant impact also in terms of birth rates, right? So the fact that firms were bringing production back home, we would have expected this decision to have a positive impact on birth rates of local subcontractor in the same region, but this is not the case. So how do we explain this lack of significant effect on birth and survival rates and this positive significant effect in terms of productivity growth? And as Gary already anticipated, we have this explanation that is associated with a descriptive analysis we perform on this data. What we found is that the large majority of these micro and small enterprises tend to engage in this dual sourcing decision. So essentially, when they engage in offshore outsourcing, so they create links with foreign suppliers, they tend to preserve their domestic links with local subcontractors, right? And we don't have any information. Unfortunately, the database does not allow us to find the reason and to understand the reason why these firms, these micro and small enterprises, decide to preserve their domestic subcontracting links when they engage in offshore outsourcing. And obviously, these can be related, to a risk reduction strategy, or to the fact that most of these links tend to be long-term subcontracting links associated with, trust, the industrial district story, the fact that we have buyer-supplier links tend to be stable over time. And for this specific subsample of firms, these buyer-supplier relationships seem also to survive offshore outsourcing. Why is this related to our result? Well, what we think is that micro and small enterprises preserve their links with domestic supplier. So when they bring production back home, they can exploit local subcontracting links, generating a positive spillover effect for local subcontractors. And this is, of course, an interpretation that can work, right, for this specific subsample of firm. Again, be aware that we are focusing only on a specific labor-intensive industry, right, footwear and clothing production, and we are focusing on micro and small firm reshoring decision. It is certainly possible that a different story will be true if we look at large multinational corporation or large firms. Maybe their reshoring decision will have different impacts on the local subcontracting networks, and this is possible, something to be inspected and be the focus of future research on this topic. So to conclude these empirical analysis, we did not find any significant impact of reshoring by micro and small firms in terms of local subcontractors' birth and survival rates, but we found this positive correlation between reshoring decision by micro and small firms and local subcontractor productivity growth. How do we explain this positive relation between reshoring and local subcontractor productivity growth? Again, we have this dual sourcing explanation. So the idea that the dual sourcing decision taken by micro and small firms allow to preserve local subcontracting links and to enhance local subcontractor productivity when production is moved back home through reshoring decision. And of course, we are happy to hear your opinion. This is only a possible interpretation, and we look forward to hear your comments on this and possible alternative explanation as to why this happens. Thank you.
Thank you, Jacopo and Gary, for that deep analysis of evidence from Italy into reshoring and its implications, with the, in a way, I guess, surprising finding that it has positive benefits for productivity of local firms.